welcome to episode 27 of Thursday with Charlie. It's the 5th of November, 2020. 27 episodes already. That's amazing to me. And there's still plenty of material, and you're providing plenty of great questions, which is awesome. We do need to keep the reservation system going. The diocese reminded us again this week that they really want to make sure we have names and phone numbers for everybody who's attending our masses. So please keep up making those reservations on Thursday and Friday between the hours of 9 and 3 by calling the church at 702-298-0440. However, because we can take increased capacity, if you forget to make the reservation, please don't hesitate. Come and we will take your phone number and name at the church door for the masses. We are planning on going back to the Riverside, but again, I repeat, they do not want to take us back until they're using their showroom for shows as well as having us in there. So when that happens, when they start doing shows again there, then we'll go back very happily there. Looking forward very much. And of course, I remind you, Bishop George Leo Thomas has given us all a dispensation from the obligation of attending Mass if you feel safer, if you would rather, if you cannot get a reservation, whatever the reason. And the Diocese of Las Vegas, whether you're a resident or a visitor, there is no obligation to attend Mass until after the end of November. And that might very well be extended into December. We'll see when we get to there. Yesterday, November the 4th, was my feast day, the feast of St. Charles Borromeo. And I love talking about St. Charles. I always have had a great admiration for him as my patron saint of my name, patron saint that I hope to follow. You might notice I have a chessboard over here, and the chessboard is one of the things I picked up as a gift in the Poconos many years ago, and I got it for the wonderful price of $10, an onyx chess set, whole board and the pieces and everything. It's one of my great bargain finds that I have, and so I'm very glad to have it. But chess was one of St. Charles Borromeo's favorite hobbies. He loved it for recreation. In fact, there's a story about him that he was asked, if you were playing chess and you found out that the world was going to end within an hour, what would you do? And without hesitating, St. Charles responded, I would continue playing chess, because I'm supposed to always be ready for what might happen in the future. No reason to spoil a chess game. And so he continued playing chess. But he has an interesting life story. He came from the Borromeo family in Italy and was born in the early 1500s. And he was made a cardinal at the age of 21. A cardinal in the Catholic Church at the age of 21. He was not even a priest. He was just named a cardinal. Now, the fact that his uncle was the Pope is what made that possible. But Charles took it seriously, and he decided if he was going to be a cardinal, he was going to be a very good one. And so he studied for the priesthood after he became a cardinal, and at the age of 25, 4 years later, he was ordained as a priest. Can you imagine his classmates going to school with a cardinal of the church to learn to become a priest? And after that, he was named the Archbishop of Milan in Italy, and that's where he spent most of his life. He was very active in the work of following after the Protestant Reformation, and he was very active at the Council of Trent. And he's left us some beautiful writings, some impressive things. I just have a couple of quotes from him. I'll take the time, because I think you can learn a lot about a person by reading or hearing what that person said. So these are quotes from St. Charles Borromeo in the 1500s. If we wish to make any progress in the service of God, we must begin every day of our life with new eagerness. We must keep ourselves always in the presence of God as much as possible, and not in any other view or any other activity, but always to do things for the divine honor. Be sure that you first preach with the way you live. If you do not, people will notice that you say one thing but live otherwise. And they will, and your words will bring only cynical laughter and a derisive shake of the head. God wishes us not to rest upon anything but upon his infinite goodness. Do not let us expect anything, hope anything, or desire anything but from him, and let us put our trust and confidence in him alone. So wonderful thoughts. I'll put those in the bulletin probably the week after next. I think they're worthwhile for us to think about. So I had a nice feast day, the celebration of St. Charles Borromeo. When my mother was alive, it was always a day on which we would go out to eat and we would celebrate. And I've always had a great devotion. By the way, I should mention St. Charles Borromeo died at the age of 46. And so I'm considerably older than he ever was, and I like to look back and so I can say, well, when when St. Charles was my age, he had already been dead for several decades. He accomplished a lot in his life. Well, we got a lot of good questions this week, and they were fun tackling and looking up and thinking about. One of the questions we got was a question about people who are pro-life. Are they really pro-life, or are they just pro-birth? And it was actually raised in the question, well, shouldn't someone who is pro-life be just as eager to be against the death penalty as they are against abortion? I would rephrase that question if I were asking and say, well, then, if that's your way of logic, shouldn't those who are against the death penalty be just as eager to be against abortion if they want to be consistent? Pro-life is interesting because abortion is one of those issues where it really is non-negotiable. There isn't any real question that life begins at that moment of conception, and therefore that innocent life needs to be protected. When we're speaking about the death penalty, we're not exactly talking about innocent life, so there is a difference there. And I should point out that for most of its history, the Catholic Church has been supportive of the death penalty. In fact, it wasn't until August 2nd, 2018, that's a little over 2 years ago, that Pope Francis made a change in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2267, and it used to read that the death penalty was admissible only in extreme cases. Pope Francis had it changed to the death penalty is never admissible. I would put forward that that's a change not in doctrine, it's a change in the way we act. And so it remains somewhat of a gray area. St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s was very much in favor of the death penalty. In fact, he felt it was one of the duties of the nations to take care of their citizens and protect them. And if they could not do it in any other way, from persons who were harmful to their citizens, then the death penalty was acceptable. That's in the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas. So what we have now is a way of acting in our current age where the Church says, well, we should not use the death penalty. And that's not up there in the same level as what we believe in the Creed. So for a person to say, I believe that the death penalty could be used in a particular instance, would still be somewhat acceptable. It's not like the person says, we no longer believe in one God. That's in the Creed. We have to hold to that. So we'll see where it goes. But it's only been a little more than 2 years out of the 2,000-year history of the Church that there's been any official statement officially opposing the death penalty. We also received another question. What about the veil of Veronica? What is it and where is it? Now, this provoked some wonderful thoughts in my mind, and I'm going to ramble a little bit. The first rambling is there's actually an audio tape from the 1970s called Veil of Veronica. And that audio tape was put together by Bill Burke and Don Cunningham, both of whom were priests in the Archdiocese of Chicago in the 1970s. And it is hysterically funny. If you are able to obtain a copy of it, I strongly recommend doing it. The parish in which, the mythical parish in which they made the tape was called Veil of Veronica. And the pastor was an elderly, very conservative pastor who was named Father Frank Stagnant, with all that that implies. And he was assigned a lively young assistant named Father Blaise Teflon. Their antics and the stories that they go through are amazing and funny, especially if you've lived through the church for many, many years. I don't believe the cassette tape is any longer available, but I did notice on Amazon.com that there are some copies of a CD with that recording still on it that was made maybe about 20 years ago. It's probably worth looking into, or if you still happen to have the old cassette, it is worth listening to. So that's what Veil of Veronica brought to my mind. First of all, the wonderful time I had with that cassette. But then it reminded me of something else. Maybe you recall back in the 1990s, 1997 to be exact, there was a TV show called Nothing Sacred that aired on WABC TV. It only ran for 14 episodes, although they actually made 20 episodes of the show. And it ran from September 1997 until March of 1998. I loved that show. One of the writers of the show was actually a priest, and he had some very good insights into life within the church, and they showed up beautifully. It was an hour-long show, and a very serious show. It was very worthwhile to look at, and I found great times watching it. It was one of the shows I looked forward to so very much. Well, I loved it so much that I wrote a letter to our diocesan paper saying how much I loved the show. And I got a phone call from the editor of our diocesan paper in New Jersey saying we would never publish a letter like that. The show is awful. We would never do anything to support it. And I said, no, the show is actually very good. I live in a rectory. Whoever's writing this has lived in a rectory. They're telling us some true things about life in the church. However, I got nowhere with that, and my letter was never published. So my next train of attack was the character in the show, the lead character, was played by an actor named Kevin Anderson. And Kevin Anderson played Father Ray, who was the lead character in the show. And so I wrote a letter to Father Ray, Kevin Anderson, care of ABC, telling him that I had tried to have a letter published in my diocesan paper and it wasn't allowed, and how much I enjoyed the show and I supported him in what he was doing in the show. And about 2 weeks after I mailed my letter, the show was taken off the air. There had been a boycott of the advertisers that some people in the church had organized, and it was taken off the air. And I think, well, here I am. My gosh, I wrote to the paper. My letter was never published, and I got yelled at by the editor of the paper. I write to the main character in the show, and the show is taken off the air. He probably never got my letter. Well, about 2 months later, in late May of 1998, after the show had been off the air for 2 months, I'm out visiting some people in my parish, and I did not have a cell phone at the time, and I get home and my secretary says to me, I have a message for you. Someone called and he identified himself as Father Ray and says he wanted to talk to you. And I thought, oh, it couldn't possibly be. Well, I returned the phone call, and sure enough, it was Kevin Anderson. He was the actor who had played Father Ray in the show, and he said, I have to tell you, I loved your letter. I want to meet you. And I said, wow, this is cool. And I was living in New Jersey at the time, and Kevin Anderson said, I've just gotten the role in Death of a Salesman, a revival, over in New York City. Would you please come as my guest? And I said, well, this is wonderful. And so we picked a night, and I went over to New York City, and I went to see the show. I had a wonderful orchestra seat right in front of the stage. It was gorgeous, probably a better seat than I could ever afford. The show was wonderful, and acting in the show, along with Kevin Anderson, was Brian Dennehy. And so at the end of the show, Kevin had said to me, wait outside at the stage door. Well, we had never met one another, but at the end of the show, I go outside and I'm standing by the stage door, and I was one of maybe 20 people who were out at the stage door. I was the only male. They were all females, and they were all waiting because Kevin is kind of good looking, and they were waiting for him to come out. Well, Kevin comes out the stage door, spots immediately that I'm the only guy there, says, Charlie, and I said, yes, and he takes his bag, his satchel that he had with him, like a gym bag, and he tosses it to me and says, wait for me, and he talked to the fans, and then after he came over to me, and he says, would you want to meet Brian Dennehy? And I said, yes. So we go inside, and I got to meet Brian Dennehy, and we got a little conversation going, and then Kevin and I went out to eat in New York. By then it was about 11 o'clock at night. We stayed talking for almost 4 or 5 hours together. It was an absolutely wonderful time. And he said, you know, when I got your letter, he said, I didn't know how to respond because it didn't fit the character of any letters I had gotten. He said the other letters were either from people condemning me for being in this show and playing the part of a priest, or they were from young females who wanted to go out with me. He said, your letter didn't fit either category. He said, but I knew I wanted to see you. And we had a wonderful time. And actually, we kept up the relationship. And a few weeks later, he called me at my parish, and he said, I want to come out and see your parish. And I thought that'd be wonderful. So we picked a day, and he said, I don't have a car. I'm going to rent a car. So I said, that's fine. So I'm waiting and waiting for him to come and meet me for lunch. And sure enough, he pulls up in a red Corvette convertible that he had rented in New York City. And we drove around the parish, and I got to wave at people from the red Corvette convertible. We had a really good time. He's actually quite a nice man and a very good actor, and I enjoyed getting to meet him. Now, back to the original question, which was, where is the Veil of Veronica, and what is it? Well, it actually has a very interesting history. The Veil of Veronica story is that on the way to Calvary, to his crucifixion, a woman named Veronica went up to Jesus while he was walking with his cross, and she felt sorry for him, and she took her veil that she was wearing on her head and gave it to him to press against his face to remove the sweat and tears and all that, and the blood stains and all of that. And that when she looked at the veil, it had been imprinted with a picture of Jesus' face. Now that's the way the story goes. The Veil of Veronica is also known as the sudarium, which basically in Latin means the sweat cloth, the sudarium. Well, when you look at the story, it really sounds beautiful, and we do honor it in our Stations of the Cross. It's the 6th station of the cross. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. However, when you look at the actual event, well, first of all, the name Veronica comes from 2 words, vero, meaning true, and icon, meaning image. So isn't it strange that the very woman who would have an image of what Jesus really looked like on her veil should be named Veronica, true image? That's the first thing that says we might be dealing with legend over here. Then if you look at the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nowhere in the 4 Gospels is Veronica or her veil or anyone coming up to Jesus and wiping his face on the way to Calvary mentioned at all. So it is not in the Scriptures. In fact, the first mention of the Veil of Veronica doesn't occur until the year 1199, when it shows up in the writings of some monk over in Europe talking about it. And it doesn't show up in the Stations of the Cross until the year 1670, when the number 14 was finally assigned. There had been Stations of the Cross earlier, but they varied in number from 5 to 20. The number 14 in 1670 was selected as these are the Stations of the Cross, and the incident with Veronica wiping the face of Jesus shows up in that edition, 1670. Well, following that, there are stories about the veil being displayed in a frame in St. Peter's Cathedral. And there's also references to the Vatican ordering that any copies of that image should be destroyed. Only the one image would remain. And then after the 17 and 1800s, it's not spoken of anymore, and it seems to have disappeared. There's no reference to it being taken out of Rome. So if something existed that was considered the veil of Veronica, it's probably somewhere in the Vatican archives right now. But the fact that it was actually a veil of a woman named Veronica, who at the time of Jesus' crucifixion wiped his face with it, is highly unlikely, especially since the first mention of it did not occur until nearly the year 1200. That's the Veil of Veronica story. Next question was, what's the difference between being Christian or being Catholic? And it's actually a kind of interesting thing to look at. In the early days of the church, there was nothing but Catholic, but they weren't called Catholic until the 2nd century. They were called followers of Christ or followers of the way. It's only that later on that the terms Catholic, Christian came to be used. But in the early days of the church, the first several centuries, if you were Christian, you were Catholic. There were no other Christians. There were a couple of small sects that developed over the years, but nothing of any major importance. So Catholic and Christian were interchangeable in the early years of the church. In 1054, there was a break between the Eastern Empire and the Western Roman Empire, and that break was the break between Roman Catholic and Orthodoxy. It's called the Great Schism, and that occurred in 1054. So only beginning in 1054 could you speak of Christians, the Orthodox, who were not Catholic. And then later on, we know in 1517, there was the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, the 95 Theses, and that's when we had Christian groups like Presbyterians and Lutherans, Episcopalians, Anglicans develop, so that there were other groups of Christians besides Catholic. I guess the easy way to understand it is all Catholics are Christians, but not all Christians in our present age are Catholics. That's the way to understand that. Next question had to do with, why do we pray to saints if God knows what we need before we ask him? Why do we pray to saints? And actually, I think we should phrase that differently. I think the real question is, why do we pray through saints, not to saints? We're talking to them, yes, because we believe that there are people who have gone before us into eternity, who are celebrating eternity with God, and we can sometimes feel more comfortable speaking with them than with God himself. I like to think of it sort of like a family matter. You might have an older brother or sister or someone to whom you feel close, and you might go to that person to help you get the strength to go to your mother or your father when you were a young child. I think saints fall into that category. We find someone we're very comfortable with, and we feel comfortable speaking to that person almost as an equal, whereas we might not feel that same sense of comfort speaking directly to God. I know I mentioned my patron saint, St. Charles Borromeo. I'm very fond of speaking with St. Charles when I'd like to discuss something with him, and I certainly expect that St. Charles is bringing my thoughts to God as well. Not denying that God knows them already, but sometimes it helps me clarify them inside myself if I start putting them into words. Now we got a liturgical question. Why does the priest and deacon kiss the altar when you approach the altar and when you leave the altar? There's actually a couple of reasons for that. One is because on the altar, the body of Christ and the blood of Christ will be made present. And so we reverence the altar, we kiss the altar when we go to it, knowing that that's going to happen, and we reverence the altar, kiss the altar when we're leaving it, because it has held the body and blood of Christ. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is, in olden days, Mass, the liturgy, was celebrated on the tombs of the martyrs. And it was common, fairly common in the church up through the 1960s or 70s, that every altar contained a relic, a piece of bone, a piece of cloth, something from the life of a martyr or several martyrs. And so in reverencing the altar and kissing the altar when we approach it and when we leave it, we're also giving reverence to one of the saints or several of the saints who have served God well throughout the ages. And our last question for this week had to do with, we have Mass in the casino. Well, we don't have it right now, but we're looking forward to going back to the Riverside. And I'm very proud of the fact that we are the only Catholic church in the country, possibly in the world, which has this type of relationship in an ongoing basis with the casino. And the question was, is there something wrong with that we're going to a place where some people consider it less than church-like, maybe even sinful if you want to view gambling in those lights, or other things that might go on in a casino? I think we can approach this in a couple of ways. One, the church has always gone where the people are. And if you're in Laughlin, in Nevada, in a gambling town, in a gambling state, our people are very likely to be in a casino. So there's something kind of expected almost that the church should be present there. And also the idea of the Mass being celebrated in there. We had a lector once who commented, once you close the doors to that showroom, it's a church. It's not just a casino. And so we like being there. We like being where our people are. We like making the liturgy very accessible to them. And we do look forward very much to going back to the Riverside. Now it's time for our visit from our local owl over here. And as usual, Pascal has something in his beak for us. And as usual, it's a wonderful Latin saying. And Animus Risu Novatur. Animus Risu Novatur. It's a quote from the Roman writer Cicero, and basically it translates as, our spirits are strengthened, are uplifted by laughter. Our spirits are uplifted by laughter. I think there's something nice to be said about that. It's not all doom and gloom. Even this time with the COVID virus, even the things that go on in our world or in our lives around us, they're not all doom and gloom. There's always hope. And if we can bring a smile to people's faces, if we can help them to get through the day, I think it's a wonderful thing. I had a quote from a bishop once. It was Bishop David Morneau of the Diocese of Green Bay. And he actually gave a lecture at my seminary when I was in the school. This goes back quite a few years. When he gave the lecture, he spoke to us and he said, if you can make people smile when you're giving your sermon, do it. They've had a hard week. I've always kept that in my mind. And I leave you with that thought. Have a wonderful week. God bless you and God love you.